Many denied Christ, but even so, he did not abandon them. What if the most dangerous way to deny Christ is not to curse his name, not to mock his truth, not to openly walk away from the gospel, but to keep saying you believe while slowly living as if his presence no longer changes anything in you? That is the kind of denial few people fear, because it does not always look dramatic. It can happen inside church walls. It can happen inside prayers that still sound spiritual. It can happen in the life of someone who still opens the Bible, still speaks about grace, still knows the right answers, but has quietly started protecting comfort more than obedience. Many people imagine denial as one terrible moment, a public failure, a shocking betrayal, a scene that everyone can see. But the soul is rarely lost in one loud decision. Most of the time it drifts through smaller compromises, quieter silences, repeated excuses. One moment you hesitate to stand for truth. Another moment you hide your conviction to avoid rejection. Then, without even realizing it, you start building a version of faith that allows you to stay close enough to Christ to feel safe, but far enough from him to avoid the cost of surrender. That is why this message matters so deeply. Because many have denied Christ, and yet he did not abandon all of them. Some were broken by what they had done, some were confronted by their own weakness. Some discovered that the mercy of Christ goes where shame says it should never go, but not everyone who denied him responded the same way. That is where this becomes personal. The real question is not only who denied Christ in Scripture, the real question is whether you have been denying him in ways that are harder to detect, easier to justify, and far more dangerous because they leave you feeling normal while your heart moves farther away. This is not a message about condemning weak people. It is a message about exposing what hides behind spiritual appearances. It is a message for the person who still believes but has become divided inside. For the person who loves Christ but knows there are areas of life where fear, pride, approval, or secret compromise have taken too much space. And it is also a message of hope, because the story of Christ is not only about how people failed him, it is also about how he responded when they did. He saw the denial, he saw the fear, he saw the collapse, and still, in ways that are almost too merciful to believe, he kept calling, confronting, and reaching for hearts that thought they had ruined everything. So before you listen to this as a story about others, listen to it as a mirror. Ask yourself where your faith has become quieter than your fear. Ask yourself where your public identity still says Christian, but your private choices say something else. Ask yourself whether you have mistaken religious familiarity for true faithfulness, because once you see how denial really works, you will understand why the most dangerous kind is the one that does not even look like denial at first. The most dangerous denial is the invisible one. The denial that destroys a soul most deeply is often the one that never announces itself. It does not come wearing the face of rebellion. It does not always appear with anger against God or hatred toward Christ. Sometimes it comes dressed as normal life. It hides inside routines, ambitions, relationships, fears, and habits that seem harmless at first. That is what makes it so dangerous. You do not resist it because you do not recognize it. You do not confess it because you do not name it. You do not fight it because it has learned how to live beside your faith without immediately disturbing your image of yourself. This kind of denial happens when Christ remains important to your identity, but no longer central to your decisions. You still want him near enough to comfort you, forgive you, and bless what you do, but not close enough to interrupt what you want. You do not reject him with your mouth. You simply stop letting him rule where it costs too much. And because there is no scandal, no public collapse, no obvious turning away, you begin to believe everything is still fine. But invisible denial is powerful because it teaches the heart how to separate devotion from obedience. A person can sing about surrender and still protect the one thing Christ is asking them to release. A person can speak about holiness and still make private peace with patterns they know are grieving the spirit. A person can defend biblical truth in conversation and still deny that truth when courage becomes expensive. This is why invisible denial is not small. It is subtle, but it is serious. It is the quiet decision to preserve self while keeping the language of discipleship. It is the slow rearranging of life so that Christ is honored in theory, but not obeyed in the places where obedience would expose fear, pride, desire, or compromise. And this is exactly why so many people never realize how far their heart has moved. They are not trying to become enemies of Christ. They are simply trying to avoid discomfort. They want peace without confrontation, faith without cost, identity without transformation. But Christ never called people merely to admire him. He called them to follow him. The moment his truth becomes negotiable for the sake of convenience, acceptance, or control, denial has already begun, even if the lips still say his name. The invisible denial is the one that feels manageable, respectable, and easy to defend. But it slowly weakens the conscience. It trains the heart to ignore conviction. It creates a version of spirituality where a person can remain outwardly religious while inwardly drifting from the presence of God. That is why the greatest danger is not always the obvious fall. Sometimes the greatest danger is the denial you have learned to live with so comfortably that it no longer alarms you. And once that happens, the next question becomes even more unsettling. What happens when faith itself starts turning into a performance? When faith becomes a performance instead of a conviction? One of the most tragic things that can happen to a believer is not losing religious language, but keeping it after the heart has stopped trembling before God. That is where faith begins to turn into performance. Everything on the outside can still look convincing. The words are there, the gestures are there, the routines are there, the appearance of devotion is there. But something essential has shifted. Christ is no longer the living center of the inner life. He becomes part of the image a person carries, part of the structure they maintain, part of the identity they present. And once faith becomes something to display instead of something to live, denial takes on a more refined and dangerous form. Performance-driven faith knows how to survive in public spaces. It knows what to say, when to say it, and how to sound sincere. It can imitate intimacy with God while hiding distance from him. It can speak about surrender while secretly negotiating every costly area of obedience. That is why this condition is so deceptive. It does not feel like unbelief. It feels like control. A person learns how to preserve the appearance of spiritual life without submitting to the uncomfortable work of being transformed. And little by little, truth stops being a fire that purifies and becomes a costume that protects. This is not only about hypocrisy in the most obvious sense. It is about the human temptation to use faith as shelter from exposure. When conviction is alive, the soul allows Christ to search it, confront it, and change it. But when performance takes over, the goal changes. The person no longer wants to be fully known by God. They want to remain acceptable before others and sometimes even before themselves. The result is exhausting. You begin to manage perception instead of pursuing purity. You begin to protect your role, your image, your reputation, your spiritual credibility. And in doing so, you may still be near the language of Christ while becoming increasingly distant from his voice. This is why some people remain active in spiritual things and yet feel strangely empty inside. The activity continues, but conviction weakens. The vocabulary remains, but the tenderness of conscience fades. The body is present, but the soul is guarded. At that point, faith is no longer flowing from love and reverence. It is being sustained by habit, fear of exposure, or the need to keep a certain image alive. And that is a devastating place to be, because performance can hide from people very well, but it cannot hide from Christ. He does not only hear what is spoken, he sees what is being protected behind the words. What makes this even more sobering is that many people do not choose performance because they hate God. They choose it because they are afraid of what real surrender will require. Real conviction demands honesty. It demands that faith move beyond public identity and enter private decisions. It demands that Christ be obeyed not only where obedience is admired, but where it is costly. And that is where many hearts hesitate, because the moment faith stops being useful for image and starts demanding death to self, the soul is forced to reveal what it truly loves most. So the real issue is not whether a person still looks faithful. The real issue is whether their faith still comes from a heart that has been conquered by truth. Because once belief becomes theater, the danger grows quietly and deeply. A person can spend years performing loyalty while avoiding the one moment that would prove it. And when that moment comes, the need to be accepted can become stronger than the courage to stand with Christ. That is where denial becomes painfully personal. The moment you chose acceptance over truth, there is a moment that does not look dramatic on the outside, but defines something deeply on the inside. It is the moment when you realize what is right, what is true, what Christ would call you to do, and yet you feel the weight of another force pulling you in the opposite direction. It is not always pressure in the form of persecution. Sometimes it is something more subtle, more familiar, more difficult to resist. The desire to be accepted, the fear of being misunderstood, the discomfort of standing alone when everyone else seems to be moving in a different direction. In that moment, the soul faces a quiet but decisive choice. Will you remain aligned with truth, even if it costs you something? Or will you adjust your response to preserve your place, your relationships, your image? This is where denial often happens, not through loud rejection, but through silent compromise. You do not need to say anything against Christ. You simply need to say nothing when truth requires your voice. You do not need to abandon your faith publicly. You only need to soften it enough so it does not disturb anyone around you. And this is why that moment is so powerful, because it reveals what is truly governing your heart. When acceptance becomes more valuable than truth, something shifts internally. The voice of conviction becomes quieter. The need to belong becomes louder. You begin to measure your responses not by what is right, but by what will be received, not by what honors Christ, but by what protects your comfort. And over time, this pattern begins to reshape your identity. You are no longer responding as someone grounded in truth. You are responding as someone adapting to avoid tension. What makes this even more dangerous is that it often feels justified. You tell yourself it is wisdom. You call it balance. You convince yourself that it is not the right moment, not the right place, not the right audience. And sometimes discernment is necessary. But when that reasoning becomes a consistent pattern of avoiding clarity, avoiding conviction, avoiding the cost of being aligned with Christ, then something deeper is happening. It is no longer discernment, it is quiet denial. Christ never promised that following him would make you universally accepted. In fact, he made it clear that truth would often create division. Not because truth is harsh, but because it exposes what people would rather keep hidden. And when you choose acceptance over truth, you are not only avoiding conflict with others, you are creating distance between your heart and the one you claim to follow. Because every time truth is compromised to preserve comfort, the soul becomes less sensitive to conviction and more dependent on approval. This is where many people begin to live divided lives. Outwardly, they still carry the identity of someone who believes. Inwardly, they are negotiating that belief every time it becomes inconvenient. And the more this happens, the easier it becomes. The tension fades. The compromise feels normal, the silence becomes natural, until one day you realize that what once felt like a struggle now feels like routine, and that is the danger. Because the moment you chose acceptance over truth may not have felt like a turning point, but it begins a path where the voice of Christ competes with the voices around you. And if that pattern continues, something else begins to happen, something even more subtle and more dangerous. The distance does not appear suddenly, it grows quietly. The quiet distance that grows without you noticing. Distance from Christ rarely begins with a decision to walk away. It begins with small adjustments that feel harmless at the time, a delayed obedience, a postponed conviction, a moment where you know what is right, but choose to deal with it later. Nothing feels broken, nothing feels urgent, and that is exactly why it is so dangerous. Because the soul does not always drift through rebellion, it often drifts through neglect. At first, the difference is almost imperceptible. Your prayers become slightly less sincere. Your attention becomes more divided. The things that once stirred your heart now feel familiar, predictable, less intense. You still believe, but the sense of closeness begins to fade. Not because Christ has moved, but because your heart has slowly started to anchor itself in other things. Responsibilities, desires, distractions, ambitions, fears, none of them seem wrong on their own. But together, they begin to occupy the space where God once had full access. This kind of distance is not loud. It does not alarm you immediately. It does not interrupt your routine. You continue living, speaking, interacting, even engaging with spiritual things. But something subtle has shifted. The urgency to respond to God weakens. The sensitivity to conviction dulls. What once felt like a clear inner direction now feels distant, almost optional, and without realizing it, you begin to build a life where Christ is present, but not central. The most unsettling part is that you can adapt to this distance. You learn how to function without the same depth of connection. You adjust your expectations. You redefine what is normal. And because there is no immediate consequence, no visible collapse, no external crisis, you assume everything is still under control. But distance changes the way you perceive truth. It affects how you respond to correction. It influences how you interpret your own actions. The farther the heart drifts, the easier it becomes to justify what once would have been confronted. This is where denial deepens. Not through a single moment, but through a pattern that slowly reshapes your inner world. You are no longer resisting Christ directly. You are simply no longer responding to him with the same priority. And that is enough to create separation, because following Christ has never been about occasional agreement. It has always been about continuous alignment. And then, one day, something happens. A moment of clarity, a confrontation. A realization that something is not as it used to be. You notice that what once moved you deeply now feels distant. What once demanded your attention now competes with other priorities. And a question begins to form, quietly but persistently. How did I get here? The answer is rarely found in one decision. It is found in the accumulation of many small ones. And that is what makes it so important to understand. Because once you see how distance grows, you begin to recognize that knowledge alone is not enough to protect you. You can know truth, understand truth, even teach truth, and still find yourself drifting. Why knowing Christ does not mean remaining faithful. There is a dangerous assumption that quietly settles into the heart of many believers. The idea that knowing Christ is enough to remain close to him. That once you have understood the truth, experienced his presence, or walked with him for a certain time, you are somehow less vulnerable to drifting. But knowledge, by itself, has never been a guarantee of faithfulness. In fact, some of the most painful forms of denial come from those who knew exactly who Christ was. and still chose something else in a decisive moment. Knowing Christ gives you clarity. It gives you direction. It reveals what is true and what is not. But it does not remove your freedom to choose, and that is where the tension lives. Because every day, in ways both small and significant, you are still deciding what governs your life. Knowledge can inform you, but it cannot replace surrender. Experience can mark you, but it cannot sustain obedience without a willing heart. And familiarity with spiritual things can even become dangerous if it creates a false sense of security. A person can know Scripture and still ignore its call. A person can recognize the voice of conviction and still resist it. A person can have memories of deep encounters with God and still choose comfort when obedience becomes costly. That is why faithfulness is not sustained by what you once understood, but by what you continue to choose. It is not built on past moments, but on present alignment. This is where many people become confused. They look at their history with God and assume it will carry them forward. They rely on what they felt, what they learned, what they experienced. But the reality is that every stage of the journey requires a renewed response. Christ does not call you only once. He calls you continually. And each time, the heart must decide again whether it will follow or negotiate. The danger of relying on knowledge is that it can create distance without awareness. You begin to replace dependence with familiarity. You start to assume that because you understand truth, you are living in it. But understanding and obedience are not the same. One informs the mind, the other transforms the life. And when the two become separated, the illusion of faith remains while its power begins to fade. This is why some people can speak about Christ with clarity while living disconnected from his authority. The words are accurate, the theology is correct, but the life is no longer aligned. And that disconnect creates an inner tension that cannot be ignored forever, because deep down, the soul knows the difference between knowing what is right and actually living it. And when that awareness becomes unavoidable, something begins to surface. Not just knowledge of truth, but the weight of contradiction. The realization that belief and behavior are no longer moving in the same direction. That is where the struggle becomes internal, personal, and difficult to hide. The inner conflict no one sees. There is a kind of suffering that does not come from openly abandoning Christ, but from trying to stay near him while refusing to fully yield. It is the pain of a divided heart. From the outside, everything may still appear stable. Life continues, responsibilities are handled, faith may still be mentioned, spiritual language may still be present, but inside there is tension, a quiet unrest, a growing discomfort that comes from knowing one thing is true while living in a way that does not fully agree with it. This inner conflict is exhausting because it forces the soul to carry two realities at once. You believe Christ is Lord, but there are areas where you still want control. You know what truth requires, but part of you keeps negotiating with fear, desire, pride, or the need for approval. You have not completely turned away, but neither have you fully surrendered. And that middle place becomes deeply draining, because the heart was never created to live in peace while resisting the one who made it. What makes this conflict even heavier is that many people hide it well. They learn how to function while internally struggling. They keep going, keep speaking, keep appearing strong, but beneath the surface, guilt begins to grow, confusion begins to spread, identity becomes unstable. You start asking questions you never thought you would ask. Why do I feel distant if I still believe? Why do I feel empty if I am still around spiritual things? Why does my conscience feel so restless if nothing on the outside has collapsed? The answer is painful but clear. The soul cannot thrive in contradiction. There is no lasting peace in calling Christ Lord while protecting what opposes his rule. There is no wholeness in asking for his presence while refusing his authority in the places that matter most. And even when no one else sees the struggle, the heart feels it. It feels the weight of pretending. It feels the pressure of unresolved conviction. It feels the fracture between what is professed and what is practiced. This is where many people become vulnerable to despair, not because they no longer care, but because they care and still feel trapped. They know enough to recognize the contradiction, but not enough to believe restoration is still possible. They become tired of the tension, ashamed of the inconsistency, and uncertain of who they have become. The conflict that began as quiet discomfort starts turning into something darker. Shame begins to speak. It tells the soul that the gap has become too wide, that the hypocrisy is too deep, that coming back would now be impossible or dishonest. And that is exactly where the battle becomes most dangerous. Because once shame takes hold, it stops speaking only about what you did. It starts speaking about who you are. It no longer says you failed. It says you are beyond recovery. It no longer says you drifted. It says you can never truly return. That lie has destroyed many hearts before they ever took one honest step back toward Christ. The lie that tells you it's too late to return. There is a moment in the life of many who have drifted, compromised, or denied Christ, where the struggle is no longer just about what they did, but about what they now believe about themselves. At first, conviction speaks with clarity. It points out what is misaligned. It invites change. It calls the heart back. But if that invitation is ignored long enough, another voice begins to take its place. A quieter voice at first, but far more destructive. It does not call you back. It convinces you that you no longer can return. This is the lie that has kept countless people distant from restoration. Not because Christ rejected them, but because they started to believe they had disqualified themselves. Shame begins to reshape the narrative. It takes your failure and turns it into identity. It takes your inconsistency and presents it as proof that you were never real. It takes your distance and tells you it is permanent. And the more you listen, the more convincing it becomes. You begin to think that coming back now would be hypocritical, that seeking Christ again would be dishonest after everything you have done or allowed, that your words would be empty, your prayers meaningless, your attempts too late. And so instead of returning, you remain where you are, not because you have no desire for God, but because you believe that desire no longer matters. This is where the enemy does not need to pull you further away. He only needs to keep you from turning around, because as long as you believe it is too late, you will never test whether grace is still available. You will never confront the lie with truth. You will never take the step that could change everything. But this lie collapses the moment you look at who Christ is, not just at what you have done, because Christ never based his mercy on your consistency. He never offered restoration as a reward for perfect faithfulness. If that were the case, no one would return. His mercy has always moved toward those who failed, not those who sustained themselves without falling. His call has always reached those who thought they had gone too far. The real danger is not that you failed. The real danger is that you believe your failure has more authority than his mercy, that your past has more weight than his grace, that your shame has the final word over your story. And once that belief settles in, it creates a barrier that Christ himself did not place. But the truth remains unchanged. No distance you created is greater than the distance he is willing to cross to reach you. No failure you carry is strong enough to cancel his invitation. The only thing that can keep you from restoration is not what you did, but what you now believe about his willingness to receive you again. And that leads to a truth that many struggle to accept, but desperately need to understand. Christ does not respond to your failure the way you expect him to. Why Christ does not walk away when you do. Everything in human logic suggests that when someone is denied, rejected, or abandoned, the natural response is to step back, to protect oneself, to withdraw. That is how relationships usually work. Trust is broken, distance is created, and separation follows. But Christ does not respond according to human patterns. That is what makes his character so difficult to fully grasp. When people walked away from him, failed him, or denied him, he did not immediately mirror their distance. He moved toward them in ways that reveal a kind of mercy that confronts, restores, and calls again. Christ sees denial clearly. He does not ignore it, minimize it, or pretend it did not happen. But he also does not reduce a person to their worst moment. He looks beyond the failure and sees the heart beneath it, the fear behind it, the weakness within it. And instead of closing the door, he creates an opportunity for return, not by removing responsibility, but by offering a path where truth and grace meet. This is what confuses many people. They expect rejection after failure. They expect distance after inconsistency. They expect that once they have crossed a certain line, Christ will no longer be near. But his response is not driven by your expectation. It is rooted in who he is. And who he is does not change when you fail. His nature remains consistent even when your behavior does not. That does not mean he overlooks what happened. It means he addresses it differently. He confronts without destroying. He exposes without abandoning. He calls without forcing. His goal is not to push you away because you fell, but to bring you back to a place where you can stand again, this time with a deeper awareness of your dependence on him. This is where many people struggle to receive what he offers, because it requires humility. It requires facing what you tried to avoid. It requires letting go of the image you tried to protect. And for some, that is harder than continuing in distance. But the invitation remains, not as a distant possibility, but as an active call. Christ does not wait for you to become worthy before he approaches. He approaches precisely because you are not. He does not build a barrier and ask you to climb over it alone. He comes to where you are and calls you to rise, but that call does not remove your responsibility. It places a decision in front of you, a decision that only you can make. And that is where everything changes. Because mercy may be extended freely, but returning is still a choice. The turning point. Only you can choose. There comes a point where the issue is no longer whether Christ is willing to receive you, but whether you are willing to stop resisting what his mercy is asking of you. This is the turning point, not an emotional moment only, not a passing sense of regret, not the temporary pain of realizing how far you drifted. The true turning point begins when a person stops explaining, stops hiding, stops softening the truth, and finally becomes honest before God. Many people want peace without confession. They want restoration without surrender. They want Christ close enough to heal the pain, but not close enough to expose the pride, the fear, the habits, or the attachments that helped create the distance in the first place. But return is not built on vague spiritual desire. It begins with truth. It begins when the heart says, without excuse, "This is what I have done, this is what I have protected, this is where I have denied you, and I do not want to remain here anymore." That is why the turning point is so personal. No one else can choose it for you. People may pray for you, encourage you, guide you, warn you, love you, but the moment of return still passes through your own will. You must decide whether you will continue defending the version of yourself that kept drifting, or whether you will lay it down and let Christ rebuild what compromise weakened. And that decision is costly, because pride never leaves quietly. Pride wants to stay in control even while asking for mercy. Pride wants forgiveness without brokenness. Pride wants change without death to self. But real return requires humility. It requires the courage to stop pretending. you are only tired, when the truth is that you are divided. It requires the courage to stop calling it confusion when deep down you know it has become disobedience. It requires the courage to stop blaming circumstances for choices that have now formed patterns. This is not about crushing the soul under guilt. It is about leading it into freedom through honesty. And there is something powerful that happens when a person finally stops resisting truth. What felt impossible begins to open. What felt distant begins to come near. What felt dead begins to respond again. Not because the person became strong enough on their own, but because surrender made room for grace to do what self-protection never could. The turning point is not the moment you prove yourself to Christ. It is the moment you stop fighting the mercy that was already reaching for you. Still, one final question remains. It is the question that takes this message out of theory and places it directly into the heart. Because knowing that Christ did not leave is one thing. Choosing whether you will return to him is another. He never left. But will you come back? There is a truth that remains unchanged, no matter how far you feel you have gone. Christ did not leave. The distance you feel was not created by his absence, but by the space that formed when your heart began to move in another direction. And yet, even in that distance, he did not turn away. He did not close the door. He did not erase your name. He remained present, watching, calling, waiting, not with indifference, but with a patience that refuses to give up on what he has touched. This is where everything becomes personal, because the story is no longer about denial or failure or even about mercy alone. It is about response. It is about what you will do now that you know the truth. You know that denial can be subtle. You know that distance can grow quietly. You know that knowledge is not enough. You know that the conflict inside you is real. You know that the lie of being too far gone is not from God. And now you also know that Christ did not abandon those who failed him. So the question is no longer hidden. It stands directly in front of you. Will you remain where you are, holding on to what has been separating you, or will you return to the one who never stopped reaching for you? This is not a question you answer with words. It is a question you answer with direction, with what you choose next, with what you release, with what you confront, with what you allow Christ to take control of again. Returning does not mean pretending nothing happened. It means facing everything with truth and walking back without pride. It means allowing Christ to restore what you could not fix on your own. It means stepping out of the version of yourself that learned to live divided and choosing to become whole again. And that step may feel small, but it carries eternal weight. Because every return begins with a decision that no one else can make for you. Christ is not asking for perfection before you come back. He is asking for honesty. He is not asking you to rebuild your life alone. He is asking you to stop resisting the one who is ready to rebuild it with you. He is not distant, waiting for you to prove something. He is near, waiting for you to respond. He never left. The invitation is still open. The call is still being made. The question is simple, but it will define everything that comes next. Will you come back?